Hey folks, I like to call this presentation the How to Study lecture, and I recommend that you watch this lecture at the beginning of the semester. Um, so the problem with study techniques is that yours are bad, and the extra problem with your study techniques being bad is that there are reasons that your study techniques are bad, and they're not all your fault. In fact, most of them are not your fault. You picked up bad study habits from a lot of sources, including, unfortunately, your own teachers, your parents. The most problematic is your own brain. Psychologists are also to blame for some of the bad study habits that you have. Some of the things that you're going to encounter in this lecture, you have been taught the opposite thing in school, probably. I was taught some of these learning myths growing up and didn't know that they were myths until I became a psychologist. I never heard that these were myths in my classes. I saw these bad study habits in my own textbooks, heard it from my college professors and my high school teachers, and I saw it on campus materials when I was going to school. The most problematic here is your own brain is giving you bad study habits. What do I mean by that? Your brain is not built to be a sponge that's soaking up information. And in fact, it actively avoids that. If you want an example of this, then I want you to pick up a textbook from a class that you find boring and try to read an entire chapter and remember all the important information from that chapter just by sitting and reading it once. You notice that that's impossible for 99.99% of the population. Now, it's entirely possible for your brain to soak in all that information and keep it and store it in long term memory. The human brain is very capable of doing that. In fact, there are some people we know about, we have documented cases that they actually can do what I just described. They can read an entire book and have the book memorized. So we know for a fact the human brain is capable of doing that. So why can't you? Your own brain is actively working against that ability, against you doing that. And we need to talk about why and how you can trick your brain into taking in more of that information. So I've told you that you have been lied to. What are some of the lies that you have been told? These are not the only myths about learning, but these are my the top four ones that I hate. Um, First is that studying by itself is great and everyone should be studying. You should be studying all the time. That's what college is about. I'll explain why that's a myth. Number two, this one comes from your own brain. You should study and practice until you feel confident. You should study that chemistry chapter until you feel good about it, and then you should put the book away for the night. It's not good for a lot of reasons. Number three, cramming doesn't work. How many of your high school teachers told you that you shouldn't cram for the test? It doesn't work. Now, I'm going to tell you later in this presentation that cramming for the test is a bad idea, but it's a little bit disingenuous to say it doesn't work. But I'll tell you why it's a bad idea later on. And finally, this one is psychologist's fault, is I need info to match my learning style. There are different learning styles, and my instructors need to cater to my learning style. Not only has there been accumulating evidence in the last couple of decades that learning styles are pretty much a myth, but there is now some evidence that trying to match things to your learning style can actually make you learn worse. The evidence is still not strong there, but there is not great evidence that learning styles are helpful. Okay, so they might not be hurtful, but they might be a waste of your time. So, what is the truth of all of these? So number one, like I said before, your brain is not designed to be a sponge to soak up info. So what's the truth? Your brain is designed to create information. What does that mean? Why shouldn't you study and what should you do instead? Well, I'm going to introduce some vocabulary in a minute, which is the difference between active studying versus passive studying. When I say that studying is bad, what I mean is that when most people study, they engage in passive studying, and it is not the best way to study. Active studying is much better. Active studying gets things in your brain much quicker. It is a little bit difficult, but it will, help you in the long term. What is active versus passive? Passive is when you just try to soak up the information, such as reading a book or watching a lecture. Active studying is any time that you try to create something based on the material that you are watching or reading or whatever. So, a passive way of, let's say you are trying to learn about the history of psychology, a passive way of studying would be to read a book chapter and then read the book chapter again, reread it. Active studying would be reading sections of the chapter and then trying to summarize them yourself in a presentation that you might give to another student. So if you try to think about the material in a way that you are trying to condense it to tell someone else about it, your brain is having to work more closely and in more complex ways with that information, and you're likely to remember more of it. Funny enough, you can trick your brain. This making a presentation for someone else about the material, it turns out that that works whether or not you actually give a presentation to someone else. If you sit and pretend that you're going to present the chapter to someone else and make your own PowerPoint, your brain is tricked into remembering more of the material than if you just try to reread the chapter and study it. So there's an active versus passive distinction. Now, number two, it's pretty simple. When you feel like the material is getting easier, that is not because you've learned the material. If you're trying to study for that calculus test and you're reading the chapter again, you're doing some practice problems, and it feels like you're getting a lot more confident, what that's an indication of is that your brain is shutting down and putting less effort into it. It's actually good to trick your brain into feeling like the material is more difficult. Now, when I explain this one, I like to think about going to the gym. If I have 45 minutes set aside, I'm going to go to the gym, do a decent workout, and I spend 45 minutes lifting very light weights and walking around the track and doing a bunch of exercise that is extremely easy for me to do. That exercise is not going to have that much benefit. What should I do instead? If I've got 45 minutes to exercise, I want to start off slow, maybe with a couple easy things, and then work my way up until I'm like stressing my muscles. I'm trying to lift weights that are, challenging for me. If you go to the gym and you do everything easy, the gym is not going to benefit you. We know that about training your body, right? Training your brain is the same way. If things are feeling easy, that's your brain saying, I'm not paying attention to this anymore. You're not actually getting better at it. Um, so on to the third myth, which is that cramming doesn't work. Now, this is a dangerous piece of misinformation because what happens is that, you've got a high school teacher that tells you that cramming doesn't work. You try it because you're a lazy teenager or whatever. Or you have a busy life, so you cram for a test and you pass the test. So right there, you have determined by your personal experience, you crammed for the test and it worked. So when the next test comes up, you think, well, my teacher's lying to me. I'm just going to cram for this test. And it starts this cycle where you think that cramming is going to work for those tests. Now, the truth behind it is cramming for a test can work under some circumstances for some people. The problem with it is that it's not very efficient learning. If you are able to pass a test with cramming, you tend to lose that information soon after the test is done. And why in the world are you taking college courses if you are going to forget the information after the test? That's not the point. The point is for you to remember the information long term. In addition to that, cramming is not very efficient. If you have, 5 hours free this week and you cram for the test 5 hours the night before, you will get a worse grade guaranteed than if you had spent 3 hours spread out throughout the week studying and 2 hours doing something relaxing, right? Spreading out your study sessions, not cramming the night before, right? Having long term studying where you study a little bit every day is more efficient. That way you can spend less total time studying and more time doing, working on other classes, going to your job, having a life, right? Cramming is just not good for you for a lot of reasons. Another reason cramming doesn't work for a lot of people, so it can work for some people, but many people try to stay up into the night cramming, right? You have an exam in the morning, so you stay up till 2 in the morning studying for the exam. The problem with that is that sleep is one of my favorite study techniques that I tell students when they ask me for advice. And if you cut into your sleep time to cram for a test, you are handicapping yourself, right? You're not able to give your brain's full attention to that test that's coming up. And finally, the last one is just that the learning styles approach that was popular several decades ago, spread around by psychologists, and then it was really embraced by the world of education. It turns out that modern evidence shows that there's not a great scientific basis for learning styles. If you have a way that you prefer to study for a test, that's fine. That's your opinion, that's your preference. But don't try to dedicate yourself to a certain learning style. There's not a great scientific basis that one style is better for you than other styles. You can get your information through different methods and still learn the material. So I've been really pessimistic so far in this presentation. You've been lied to, and the truth is kind of unpleasant. So we've got to go somewhere positive from here. I'm going to present two resources for you. One is a book that was written for a popular audience. It was a team of writers. One of them is a pretty famous cognitive psychologist, right? So it's scientists and writers working together to write a book that tells you all about study habits and all about effective studying that has a scientific basis, but is written to be easy to read. It's called Make It Stick: The Science of Successful Learning. If after this presentation you want to learn more about some of the techniques I'm about to tell you about, that's one resource I recommend. Now, you could go out and buy that book, but you could also look at the scientific research. There's hundreds, thousands of studies about the science of learning. So I'm going to recommend one particular study, and you can find this for free through your library. It's Dunlosky and colleagues in 2013. They summarized decades, so they did the summarization for you, right? They summarized decades of research in different ways of studying. And they present some of the most popular study habits and some of the most effective study habits. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. It turns out some of the most popular study habits, when they researched how well they worked for students, they found that those study habits are not actually very effective. Other study habits that not many people use were shown to be much more effective. And there's a pattern here of which study techniques were more effective than others that we'll talk about in a minute. First, what does the book Make It Stick? What do they have to say about what you should do when you study? Well, the first is active practice is better than passive practice. I mentioned this earlier. Active practice is any time that you're actively working with the material that you're trying to study. This is the difference between watching a movie and playing a video game. Watching a movie, you can kind of passively just let that information enter your brain. But playing a video game, you have to actively be involved with the story that you're playing through. Now, some people can actively watch a movie. If you know a lot about cinematography and you're thinking about how the movie was made while you're watching it, so it's possible for you to actively watch a movie. It is also possible for you to passively play a video game if you're not paying a lot of attention. You should try to go toward more active studying techniques, which for some people, just reading a book chapter is truly enough, but that person is rare. So, what are some real examples of what you can do to actively practice when you're studying? One is on this list, I'm going to talk about it later, self testing. Another thing is to, rather than write notes to your future self, write notes as if you were going to present the material to someone else. Even if you're just pretending, right? Even if you know you're not actually going to give someone a presentation about the material, by trying to trick your brain into thinking that you are going to tell someone else about the material, you are more actively processing it. This is one reason that study groups tend to be so effective, because when you study with other people and you explain concepts from the book to other people, your brain is working more closely with that material and holding more of it in. What else can you do for active practice? Try to read a concept, and let's say you have a vocabulary word. Rather than writing down the definition of the vocabulary word, write about a real world scenario where you might use that vocabulary word, right? Writing down real world examples, connecting to your real life, is your brain having to process the information more. You're more likely to remember it. Now, the next suggestion is to space out your studying sessions. Like I said before, if you've got 5 hours free this week to study for my class, I would rather you study 1 hour on Monday, 1 hour on Wednesday, 1 hour on Friday, and take that other 2 hours to take some naps, right? That would be better. That would be a better use of your time than trying to sit down Thursday for 5 hours in a row to study for my class. It's just not a good use of your time. The actual number of minutes is different from person to person, but we all have a shut off point where after you've been studying for a while, your brain tends to start shutting down and not keeping enough information. So, me personally, some days when I'm learning a new topic, I'll study for 20 or 30 minutes at a time and then get up and move, get some light exercise in, play a video game, have a snack, and then come back and study or read for 20 or 30 more minutes. Other days when I'm feeling alert, I'll do it for an hour at a time. We all know that that kid we went to high school with that can sit and read a book for 3 hours at a time and be fully immersed in it the entire 3 hours. Some people can do that, but it's rare. So trying to cram all your studying into one session just doesn't work well for most people. The next study technique is pretty simple. Get plenty of sleep, right? If you're enrolled in psychology classes, I'm sure you've heard that sleep affects your memory. Sleep affects your attention. If you are not getting enough sleep, then you are having to spend more time studying. Chances are, if you're having to put more time studying, it's causing you to lose sleep, which is causing your studying to be worse, which is causing you to lose more sleep. Do you see the problem here? Right? At some point, you have to face that most Americans have bad sleep habits. So try to have better sleep habits, get more sleep at night so that you don't have to study as much. The next tip is intermixing topics. What that means is if you have an hour to study, rather than studying psychology for the entire hour, try to mix it up. Maybe study psychology for 20 minutes and then switch to chemistry for 20 minutes and then switch to math for 20 minutes. The reason that intermixing topics is good is because it's frustrating. It's super annoying. I hate doing it, but it works just because my brain hates it. When you switch between topics, that keeps your brain from getting too comfortable with the topics that you're studying. So it keeps your brain on its toes, so it's paying more attention. If I try to study psychology for an hour at a time, then after 30 minutes or so, my brain starts to get comfortable, get confident, and then it's holding in less of that information. So I know that switching up your topics makes you feel uncomfortable. Most people, maybe not you, but it makes most people feel uncomfortable. But just like when you go to the gym, you should, lift weights and have just enough weight that it puts some strain on your muscles so you can like get some exercise in. The same thing is happening here where making yourself uncomfortable, getting a little stress in is helping your brain to put in the effort. Now, next is my favorite active studying technique, self-testing. The reason I like this one so much is because it takes me just as much time as the bad study habit I used to do, which is I would, read chapter 3 about brain and biology. So I would read the chapter once and take notes on the chapter. And then later, I would go back and I would read my notes again. That's what a lot of people do when they take notes for a class. It's terrible. It's terrible, terrible, terrible. It's a waste of your time. It's just a bad way to study from a textbook. Another way is spending the same amount of time but self-testing. Let's say it takes me an hour and a half to read that chapter and take good quality notes. Rather than spending an hour and a half reading the chapter and taking good quality notes, now I read the chapter and write quiz questions to my future self. It takes me the same amount of time. Now, what I do personally is I like to handwrite things. So I have like a spiral bound notebook that I use for this. And on the left page, I number questions, write easy questions for myself from whatever I'm reading. And then on the right side of the page, where I can hide it, I number and I write the answers. The thing is, I write easy questions to my future self that I plan to come back to, a day or two later after I've slept. When I'm writing those questions, so I write the same kinds of things as I would take notes on, but I write it in the form of questions instead of taking notes. It seems like I'm writing easy questions, right? I try to write a bunch of easy ones, a few medium ones, and a few hard ones. I come back a day or two later, and all those easy questions, some of them are easy, some of them are hard. What this does is because your brain knows that you're going to quiz yourself on these questions in the future, it tricks your brain into paying more attention to what's going on, the information in those questions. And so you're spending the same amount of time as you would to write notes, but your brain is holding in more of that information. Now, the other thing that this is useful for is that, let's say I go back 2 days later and I wrote myself, 50 questions, which is being a little generous, but let's say I did. I wrote 50 questions and I come back and I get 35 of them correct. Well, look at that. I have 15 questions that I got wrong, that now I know what I need to study for next time, because obviously those things didn't make their way into my brain. And then I come back and I test myself 2 days later and I get 45 out of 50 correct, right? And then I know, well, there's 5 things left I need to study. So rather than going back and having to study the entire chapter over and over again, which just takes forever and is boring, now I only have to study the 5 things that I forgot. Now, the last suggestion I'm going to talk about from Make It Stick is don't be a stenographer. Don't try to take notes in class like you're copying down exactly what the instructor is saying. Now, one reason I recommend people not use laptops to take notes. So if you're watching this and taking notes on a computer, I recommend that you don't do that. Is that when you are taking notes on paper by hand, you tend to use different note-taking strategies. Rather than writing down exactly what I'm saying, which people tend to type, when you're writing it out, you tend to write the meaning of what I'm saying. And if you try to hear what the professor is talking about and write down what they mean rather than exactly what they say, you remember more of the information later. It activates different metacognitive strategies. I'll talk about what metacognition is later in the presentation. Now, I'm not going to go back through each of these in as much detail as I went through the suggestions from Make It Stick, because there's a lot of overlap here. Now, you can go and read this article for yourself. I actually wouldn't recommend right now that you read the entire article, but they do have some summary sections in the article about how best to use these techniques and why they do or don't work. So some of the techniques that they recommend are going to be familiar from the slide before, such as distributed practice and interleaved practice. If you read the description, you'll notice that those are on the slide before, just with different names. But so Dunlosky and colleagues also evaluated those techniques and the others listed on this slide. And their question was, how effective are these different learning techniques? So not everything on this slide was shown to be an effective study technique. Let's look at which of these techniques that they gave a little review and rated these as low, moderate, or high utility. The low utility techniques are ones that don't tend to make students' grades any better. Moderate utility works for some students but not others. And high utility techniques tend to work for most students. Now, you'll notice that some of the most common study techniques, I know some of you use these techniques because they're so popular, are in the low utility category. Things like summarizing chapters, highlighting a textbook, rereading a textbook. Man, those are the most common things. I know I did those in all of my high school classes. Don't actually work that well. They're not a great use of your time when you're studying. Now, some people summarize a chapter really well. They're just really good at it. So it might work for some of you. But don't let your belief that your study techniques work be gospel, right? Because your brain lies to you. Like I said before, your brain is trying to convince you to do the least effort possible, because that's just how human brains are set up. Let me talk about a couple of these that I haven't brought up before. I'll talk about elaborative interrogation. What is elaborative interrogation? Let's look over here. So it is an active studying technique where instead of just writing down a fact from your textbook, you think about a fact from your textbook and try to come up with an explanation for why that fact is true or why that fact is important. Now, if you've been following along, you'll recognize that passively reading a textbook is just writing down a fact. Actively reading a textbook is writing about that fact and trying to come up with an explanation for why it's true. So what do these moderate utility and high utility techniques have in common for me? They're not passive studying. They are active studying. Let's look at self-explanation, right? Self-explanation is trying to connect new information to things that you already know, or connecting new information with how you could use that information for problem solving. So again, it's actively using the information from the book to connect to something that you already know. It's not just passively reading about it. The classic example of passive studying is rereading a chapter. And never reread a chapter in my class. In fact, in many of my weekly reading materials for my classes, I will present at least 2 different resources, maybe a reading assignment and a video assignment, or a reading assignment and an alternative reading from another book. If you have the opportunity, read the same information from 2 different sources. Or I like my lectures, but watch me give a lecture on a topic and then go into my optional materials and watch someone else give a lecture on the same topic. Seeing someone else give a lecture on the same topic, even if we're talking about most of the same materials, it tricks your brain into thinking, hey, some of this is new. I'm going to pay more attention to it. So the whole point of this lecture is trying to push your brain into active studying. Now, many people at this point, their reaction is, well, I don't want to change my study habits. Some people will say this out loud to me when I give this presentation. They'll just say, this all sounds great, and there's decades of scientific information that's summarized telling me that these things are good, but I personally feel like my study habits are good enough for me. Next, I'm going to try to convince you that you really should at least give these a chance. Maybe not even in my class, but please, in at least one of your classes this semester, give different active study techniques a chance. Why should you try to give these techniques a chance? First, I think your time is important to you. If you spend more efficient time studying, this means that you have more free time to pursue the types of things that college is for, right? Groups, going and learning about new things, making friends, playing video games, which I did a lot of in college, right? If you are studying more effectively, then you have extra time to catch up on sleep or just spend time on yourself, right? Next, I'm going to repeat again that your brain is not a good judge of what study habits work. Your brain is actively lying to you, trying to get you to be lazy. That's just how human brains are designed. Don't trust your own brain telling you that you shouldn't try new study techniques. When I want to, try to work on increasing my fitness or losing weight, my brain tells me that I should eat Oreos, go to the gym, walk a lap around the track, and then leave. I have to actively work to eat healthier and to get vigorous exercise that challenges me, right? Actively pursue mental exercise as well. And finally, you are going to start the college semester like everybody starts the college semester, assuming that you have enough self-control to control your study habits and make your old bad study habits work for you. That's going to break down in about 2 weeks. Nobody has perfect self-control. Nobody. Nobody has perfect self-control. Try to establish good study habits early. It's going to be work, right? But they're called study habits for a reason. If you make the work a habit, something that you do every day, it's going to feel normal. You're going to do it more consistently. It's just going to be easier for you. It's really the theme of this presentation is it's going to be hard at first, but it's going to be easier for you in the long term. Next, some reasons that have to do with brain flexibility of why you should try to use new study techniques. One is recognizing that different metacognitive strategies can go a long way toward helping you study more effectively. Metacognition, the simple definition is it's thinking about thinking. Good metacognitive strategies is not just realizing how to problem solve, but realizing what patterns there are in the problems that you are solving. So good study strategies not only involve, time management and putting the work in, but also studying efficiently, understanding what types of study strategies are good for you and which ones are bad for you. Now, next is that your memory is imperfect. Not everything that gets into your short-term memory is going to get into your long-term memory. You should expect, even if you're an intelligent student who really cares about the material that you're studying, after you study and 48 hours passes, you're going to lose most of that information. In the best case scenario, after you study, you're going to forget the things that you studied. But knowing that, and knowing that it's normal for you to study something and then forget a lot of what you studied, you can actively prevent that from happening. One simple way to do that is to study on Monday, sleep on it, take a break, and then study a little bit again on Tuesday or Wednesday. You're going to forget some things. That doesn't mean you're failing, it means you're human, and you should study some more and try different study techniques and try to get some more of that in your memory. And finally, encourage useful difficulties. I'm asking you to do difficult things. Use some of these study techniques that are going to feel uncomfortable, but don't have a bad time just for the sake of having a bad time. If you go to the gym and you do the exercises that hurt and strain your body, you might just injure yourself, right? Someone that really knows how to work out effectively is going to do a difficult workout, but get in that sweet spot where it's difficult enough that you're actually getting a benefit from it, but it's attainable. It's something you can do. Start trying out new study habits now. Make your life a little bit difficult, but try out study habits like the ones I've suggested that evidence says will work. Make your life difficult if it will help you keep more information in your brain for your future classes. Don't make life difficult on yourself for the sake of being difficult. So that's all I have to say this time. I'm just going to end on that final point, which is try out these study techniques that are going to be a little bit uncomfortable. Get outside of your comfort zone a little bit. Try some new things. I really think that it's going to improve your grades this semester. And even if your grades improve in other people's classes and not mine, I think you should view that as a success story. So be willing to try these out. Thanks for your attention. Go take a nap. You probably need it. Work on that study technique of getting more sleep.